My name is Daisy Turner. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward quietness. Archival research, compliance review, document verification. Jobs where you listen more than you speak, where people forget you're in the room. That part mattered later, though no one could have known it at the time. People usually describe me as calm, grounded. Sometimes they mean it kindly, sometimes it's another way of saying forgettable. I'm not the loudest voice at the table. I don't interrupt. I don't demand space. Growing up, that meant adults trusted me, but didn't worry about me. They assumed I was fine. That assumption followed me into adulthood, into my family, into the long silence surrounding an accident that shaped my life. This is not a story about revenge. It's not about exposing someone for the sake of punishment or proving that I was right all along. It's about what happens when truth refuses to stay buried, when old records resurface, when a witness finally decides to speak, and when the person responsible is someone you once trusted with your safety. Years ago, there was an accident. That's how it was always described. An unavoidable moment. Bad weather. Wrong place. Wrong time. I accepted that explanation because everyone else did. Because the man at the center of it, my father, was someone the world saw as dependable, ethical, solid, and because challenging that narrative would have meant challenging my own family. For a long time, I chose peace over clarity, or what I thought was peace. I built a life that didn't touch that memory too closely. I learned how to file things away, how to live with unanswered questions. I told myself that some truths don't change anything once enough time has passed. I was wrong. This story follows the slow, uncomfortable uncovering of facts that were never meant to resurface. It's about paperwork that didn't quite line up, about a name that appeared where it shouldn't have, about a woman who carried guilt for years until she no longer could, and about the moment I had to decide whether loyalty to blood outweighed loyalty to truth. I want to be clear about something before we go further. This isn't dramatized. There are no villains monologuing, no explosive confrontations, no moment where justice feels clean or triumphant. What there is, instead, is process, waiting, verification. The quiet weight of realizing that doing the right thing may cost you the last illusion of family you have. I didn't file a criminal complaint lightly. I did it after every other explanation collapsed under evidence. I did it knowing exactly what it would fracture. And I did it without hatred, only with the understanding that silence can become a form of harm when it protects the wrong person. If you're here because you faced a moment where truth threatened to dismantle something you loved, I see you. This story isn't meant to tell you what choice to make. It's meant to show you what it felt like to make mine. Have you ever discovered a truth that forced you to choose between keeping the peace and doing what felt right? For most of my life, I was the easy one. That's how my family described me when I wasn't in the room. The daughter who didn't cause trouble, the one who adapted. If something needed to be handled quietly, I handled it. If someone else needed space, I gave it. I learned early that being agreeable earned you praise, and being invisible earned you peace. At family gatherings, I was the person clearing plates before anyone asked. The one sitting beside my grandmother, refilling her tea, listening to stories I'd already heard a dozen times. People smiled at me the way you smile at someone dependable, not someone you expect to surprise you. My father liked to tell people I was practical. He said it with pride, but also finality, like that single word explained everything I was, and everything I would ever be. Practical daughters don't ask unnecessary questions. They accept explanations. They don't dig where digging might be uncomfortable. When the accident happened, that role solidified. I was still young enough then to believe that adults told the truth by default. The story was presented to me cleanly, efficiently, with no loose ends. An accident. A tragic chain of events. No one's fault. I absorbed it the way I absorbed everything else in that house, quietly, internally, without protest. My pain was acknowledged, but briefly. Not ignored, just managed. People checked in, then moved on. They assumed I'd process it on my own, because that's what I always did. I cried privately. I adjusted my expectations. I learned how to carry questions without asking them out loud. In my family system, emotions were tolerated but not examined. Grief had an expiration date. Anger was seen as unproductive. Curiosity, especially the kind that pointed inward, was quietly discouraged. So I became very good at observation instead. I noticed who spoke when certain topics came up. I noticed which details never changed in the retelling of the accident and which ones subtly shifted depending on the audience. I noticed how quickly conversations moved away from specifics. Not because I was suspicious, at least not consciously, but because paying attention had always been my safest position. To them, I was stable, resilient, low maintenance. To myself, I was unfinished. I built an adult life that mirrored that perception. I chose work that rewarded accuracy over attention. I learned how to read documents the way other people read faces. I trusted paper more than memory, records more than reassurance. If something was written down, it could be traced, verified, corrected. My father admired that about me, in his way. He called it following in his footsteps, though we worked in very different fields. He liked that I didn't challenge him, liked that I didn't revisit the past, liked that I seemed settled. What he didn't see, and what no one else really saw, was that my quietness was never the absence of thought. It was containment. I held contradictions gently, the way you hold something fragile you're not ready to examine yet. I told myself that if something mattered enough, it would surface on its own. That truth had a way of making itself known without my interference. I didn't know then how literal that would become. In the eyes of my family, I was the one least likely to disrupt anything. The one who would understand. The one who would forgive, even without being asked. If there was ever a situation that required someone to be reasonable, all eyes turned to me. That expectation shaped everything that came next. Because when you are seen as harmless, people stop guarding themselves around you. They speak more freely. They leave documents lying around. They assume you aren't keeping score. And when the time comes, when the truth begins to press outward from the cracks, that underestimation becomes its own kind of leverage. I didn't know it yet. I was still just the quiet daughter, the practical one, the one who wouldn't make trouble. But that version of me was already beginning to fade. The first moment didn't arrive like a revelation. There was no thunder to it, no internal alarm bells, just a small, sharp feeling I couldn't quite place, like realizing a door you thought was locked never really was. It happened during an ordinary conversation. The kind families have all the time without remembering later why they mattered. We were in my father's kitchen, late afternoon light, the radio low. He was flipping through mail, sorting quickly, decisively. I mentioned the accident casually, not emotionally, not accusatory. Just a passing reference, prompted by a news story playing in the background about traffic investigations being reopened years later. I said something like, "It's strange how long those things can stay unresolved." He didn't look up. "That doesn't apply to everything," he said. His tone was flat, controlled. Then after a pause that was a second too long, he added, "Some things are settled for a reason." It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't. He didn't ask why the story caught my attention. Didn't check in emotionally. Didn't meet my eyes. He moved on immediately, as if the conversation had never happened, as if my words had been background noise. At the time, I told myself I was reading too much into it. That was my instinct, to smooth things over internally before they could become problems externally. I reminded myself that my father was private, that he didn't like hypotheticals, that older generations often shut down uncomfortable topics. But something lodged in me anyway. A hairline fracture. Later that evening, my aunt mentioned the accident again, laughing lightly about how chaotic that year had been. She got one detail wrong. Just one. A date. I corrected her gently. She blinked, hesitated, then said, "Well, that's how I remember it." My father cleared his throat. "It doesn't matter," he said. "The outcome's the same." There it was again. Not denial, not anger. Dismissal. No one else reacted. The conversation rolled forward. Plates were passed. Wine was poured. The moment evaporated for everyone but me. I remember sitting there, nodding along, while something inside me recalibrated. I wasn't upset. I wasn't suspicious yet. But I felt edited. As if my memory, my experience, had been quietly overruled. That was the first small cut. It didn't bleed. It didn't hurt enough to name, but it changed how I listened after that. I started noticing how often my father framed things in terms of closure, finality, moving on. He spoke about the past like a locked room no one had permission to enter again, not even the people who had lived there. And whenever I asked something even slightly clarifying, never confrontational, he'd respond with certainty instead of explanation. "You're remembering it wrong." That was handled. There's nothing more to know. Each time it was subtle, polite, almost caring. Almost. Other people didn't see it because they weren't looking for it. And why would they? He had no reputation for dishonesty. Quite the opposite. He was known as someone reliable, ethical, a man who followed rules. And I was known as someone agreeable. So when I felt that faint sense of being corrected out of my own story, I kept it to myself. I didn't argue, didn't push. I absorbed the discomfort and filed it away with all the other things I didn't have language for yet. That's how small cuts work. They teach you where not to touch. They teach you which questions shorten conversations, which details make the room colder. They train you to doubt your own instincts before doubting someone else's narrative. But they also leave marks, invisible ones. And over time, those marks begin to line up, forming a shape you can't unsee once it's there. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment my silence stopped being passive. It was the moment it began to listen back. Once you accept the first dismissal, the rest arrive more easily. They come wrapped in familiarity, in tone, in shared history. They don't announce themselves as disrespectful. They present as efficiency, as a concern, as someone sparing you unnecessary complexity. After that afternoon in the kitchen, I started hearing it everywhere. If I asked a follow-up question, my father would sigh. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that the subject was tired. If I referenced something that didn't align perfectly with his version of events, he'd correct me quickly, then move on before I could respond. Not angrily, just decisively. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Families talk over each other. Memory is unreliable. Time changes things. These were all reasonable explanations, and I clung to them because the alternative required energy I didn't yet have. So I adjusted. I began to pre-edit my questions, softening them before they ever reached my mouth. I framed curiosity as confusion, doubt as forgetfulness. "Maybe I'm remembering this wrong," I'd say, offering him an exit before he needed one. He always took it. "You are," he'd reply without hesitation. That was the part that stayed with me. Not that he disagreed, but that he never wavered. Never said, "I might be mistaken." Never invited discussion. His certainty filled the space so completely that there was no room left for mine. Other people mirrored his tone. When I mentioned small inconsistencies to relatives, they brushed them off with practiced ease. "You're overthinking it." That was a long time ago. Why dig that up now? They weren't cruel. They were efficient. They wanted harmony, and I had always been the one most willing to provide it. So I did. I smiled. I changed the subject. I let moments pass unchallenged. And each time I did, something subtle happened. The dismissal began to feel normal. That's how disrespect settles in. Not as a rupture, but as a pattern. I noticed it in how conversations ended when I spoke. How often my thoughts were summarized instead of acknowledged. In how my father would answer questions I hadn't finished asking. It was never loud enough to justify confrontation. Never blatant enough to point to and say, "There, that's it." Which made it easier to blame myself. Maybe I was sensitive. Maybe I was fixating. Maybe I was attached to details that didn't matter. That internal rationalization became its own reflex. A way to stay aligned with the family version of reality, even when my own felt slightly out of step. But alignment has a cost. I started feeling detached from my own memories, as if they were less reliable because no one else seemed to confirm them. When something felt off, I told myself it wasn't important. When curiosity stirred, I suppressed it. Not because I was afraid, but because I had learned it led nowhere. That's the quiet violence of normalization. It doesn't break you, it reshapes you. You learn to carry doubt without expression, to live with unanswered questions as if they were resolved, to confuse peace with silence. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still the composed daughter, still the one who didn't stir old waters, still the people are described as level-headed. Inside, something was reorganizing. I began to trust the process more than conversation, documentation more than dialogue. If speaking didn't produce clarity, maybe structure would. If memory was disputed, maybe records weren't. That shift didn't feel rebellious. It felt practical. So I started paying closer attention, not to what people said, but to how they avoided saying it, to the pauses, to the deflections, to the moments when certainty arrived too quickly, like a shield raised before any threat appeared. I didn't confront any of it, not yet. I was still telling myself that staying quiet was maturity, that letting go was a strength, that respect meant not pushing. But beneath that story, another one was forming, one that understood something I hadn't fully admitted yet, that being dismissed repeatedly is not the same as being wrong, and that one day, silence would stop being a courtesy. It would become a choice. Every family has an unspoken script. No one hands it to you. No one reads it aloud. You learn it by watching what gets rewarded and what gets quietly corrected, by noticing which behaviors bring warmth and which bring tension. Over time, you stop questioning the script and start performing it. Mine was simple. Be reliable. Be understanding. Don't complicate things. I was the one people called when they needed help, but not for discussion. When they wanted something done cleanly, efficiently, without emotional residue. I was trusted with tasks, not with authority. With responsibility, not with influence. My father leaned into that dynamic without ever naming it. He praised my independence while benefiting from my compliance. He'd say things like, "You're not like other people, you don't dwell," or "You see the bigger picture." What he meant was you don't push back. And I accepted that role because it felt safer than challenging it. It allowed me proximity without friction, belonging without risk. But roles harden over time. The more consistently you play them, the more disruptive it feels when you deviate. When I did offer a different perspective, rarely, carefully, it was met with surprise, then quick correction, as if I'd broken character. "That's not like you," my father would say. Not accusingly, almost amused. And I'd retreat, embarrassed by my own misstep. I started to understand something then, though I didn't articulate it yet. My value in that system depended on my predictability, on my willingness to remain useful rather than visible. The accident sat at the center of that understanding, like a sealed envelope no one wanted opened. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a boundary, one that defined who got to speak and who was expected to listen. I was on the listening side. When anniversaries passed, my father acknowledged them briefly, then redirected the focus. When emotions surfaced, he reframed them as resolved. His language was always about closure, never about examination, and I followed his lead. I didn't ask for details, I didn't revisit timelines. I told myself that honoring the past meant not interrogating it, that love required restraint. But restraint, when it's one-sided, becomes erasure. I began to feel like a supporting character in my own history, someone whose reactions mattered less than the narrative itself. The story had been written, agreed upon, and archived. My job was to accept it. What no one realized, not even me at first, was that I was already stepping out of that role in small, almost imperceptible ways, not through confrontation, but through observation, through quiet preparation. I started keeping notes, nothing dramatic, just dates, names, fragments of conversations that didn't quite align. I told myself it was a habit, a professional reflex. I liked things organized, which was true, but it was also something else. It was the first time I allowed myself to treat my own questions as legitimate, to record them instead of dismissing them, to acknowledge that the discomfort I felt wasn't imaginary, it was informational. The role I had been assigned required me not to notice patterns. I noticed them anyway. And once you see the shape of the role you're playing, you can't fully disappear into it again. You start to recognize when people speak to the version of you they prefer, rather than the one that's actually there. I didn't challenge my father yet. I didn't even change my behavior outwardly. I was still helpful, still calm, still predictable. But inwardly, I was stepping back, observing the stage, understanding the script, and realizing slowly that at some point, I would have to choose whether to keep performing it or to step into a role no one had prepared for. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation hanging in the air. In fact, no one else noticed anything at all. That's what made it unmistakable to me. I was alone, doing something ordinary, sorting through a box of old documents my father had asked me to store years earlier. Tax records, insurance papers, certificates, The kind of box that lives in closets and basements, moved from place to place without being opened because everyone assumes its contents are settled. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I didn't even remember why the box was with me. I only knew that I'd kept it intact, untouched, because that's how I treated things that weren't mine. As I flipped through the folders, my body stayed relaxed. No anticipation, no tension, just routine. Then I saw a date. It didn't belong where it was. At first, I thought it was a filing error, something miscategorized, misprinted. I set the page aside, continued sorting, and told myself I'd check it later. That's how I've always approached anomalies. Acknowledge them, don't dramatize them. But my attention kept circling back. I took the document out again, read it more carefully this time. Not emotionally, methodically. I checked the header, the reference numbers, and the issuing office. Everything else lined up. Just not the timing. The date placed my father somewhere he'd never mentioned being. Somewhere that intersected with the timeline of the accident in a way that made my stomach tighten. Not with fear, but with recognition. This was the moment. Not discovery, not proof. Recognition. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel betrayed yet. What I felt was clarity. Sharp, grounding, almost physical. Like the moment your eyes adjust in low light and you realize the room has always been shaped differently than you thought. I sat there for a long time with that paper in my hands, and something inside me rearranged itself. I understood suddenly why certain conversations ended abruptly. Why were they discouraged? Why certainty arrived faster than explanation. This document didn't accuse anyone on its own, but it explained behavior I'd spent years normalizing. The shift wasn't toward anger. It was toward responsibility. Because once you see that something doesn't align, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to assuming. You can't pretend your silence is neutral. I didn't tell anyone about the document. Not my father, not my family, not even friends. I made no decisions that day. I didn't plan my next move. I only did one thing. I made a copy, then another. Then I put the original back exactly where it had been, restoring the box to its previous order. No disruption. No sign it had been touched. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, I crossed a line I hadn't known existed. Up until that moment, my quietness had been defensive, a way to avoid conflict, to preserve harmony. After that moment, it became intentional. I wasn't waiting for answers anymore. I was preparing to verify them. That day didn't make me confront my father. It didn't harden me. It didn't turn me into someone else. It made me still. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not certainty, not righteousness, but resolve. Whatever the truth was, I would meet it without distortion. Even if it meant stepping out of the role I'd been assigned. Even if it meant changing everything. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive. Something I slipped into when conversations felt uncomfortable or unproductive. Now it was deliberate. I wasn't avoiding questions anymore. I was postponing them. There's a difference. I continued speaking to my father the same way I always had. Same tone, same routines, same outward ease. If anything, I became more agreeable, more predictable. I asked about his health, about work, about trivial things that reinforced the version of me he was most comfortable with. And he relaxed. People can sense when they're no longer being examined. He assumed the moment had passed, whatever it was, that I'd moved on, like I always did. That assumption made him less careful, not in what he said, but in what he left unsaid. I listened, not like a daughter this time, but like an archivist. I paid attention to language, to how he described responsibility, to the way he framed mistakes as unfortunate events rather than decisions. When stories overlapped with the timeline of the accident, I noted what stayed consistent and what didn't. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge. I didn't reveal what I knew. Silence, when chosen, creates space. In that space, patterns emerge. I started requesting documents casually, not directly tied to the accident, at least not obviously. Old insurance statements, correspondence related to property and vehicles, things I could justify needing for organization or future planning. My father didn't hesitate. Why would he? I'd never given him a reason to suspect scrutiny. He trusted my competence, trusted my discretion. That trust became my access. I wasn't looking for a confession. I wasn't hoping to catch him in a lie. I was building context, slowly, methodically. I wanted to understand the full shape of what had happened before I allowed myself to react to it. Emotion would come later, or not at all. This phase wasn't dramatic. It was quiet to the point of being almost boring, even to me. I spent evenings cross-referencing dates, reading fine print, and noting discrepancies without assigning them meaning yet. What surprised me was how calm I felt. I wasn't consumed by resentment. I wasn't rehearsing confrontations in my head. If anything, I felt grounded, focused, as if the long-standing discomfort in my body had finally found a purpose. Silence had stopped being submission. It had become a strategy. And like all effective strategies, it relied on being underestimated. My family continued to see me as the non-confrontational one, the daughter who didn't dwell, the person is least likely to stir old waters. No one asked what I was doing with all that paperwork. No one wondered why I suddenly cared so much about details. They assumed I was being helpful. That assumption protected me. There were moments, late at night alone, when the weight of what I was uncovering pressed in, not as shock, but as gravity. The realization that the story I'd lived with for years was incomplete, possibly engineered. Those moments were quiet too. I didn't spiral. I didn't reach for validation. I sat with the information until it settled into something solid, something I could stand on. I wasn't preparing to accuse my father. I was preparing to understand him. Because if I was going to cross the boundary everyone else had avoided, I needed to do it cleanly, without speculation, without theatrics, without the luxury of being wrong. Silence gave me that discipline. And it gave me time. Time to decide not just what I knew, but what I was willing to do with it. What people misunderstand about preparation is that it rarely looks like action. From the outside, my life appeared unchanged. Same routines, same work, same quiet presence at family events. I still showed up when I was expected to, still listened more than I spoke, still played the role that made everyone comfortable. What they didn't notice was how intentional everything had become. I created systems, not dramatic ones, nothing that would raise questions if discovered, but thorough. I logged documents the way I'd been trained to professionally. Source, date, relevance, cross-reference. I kept everything backed up in more than one place, separated from my personal devices. I assumed nothing was accidental, but I also assumed nothing was malicious until it proved itself to be. That balance mattered. I wasn't trying to build a case yet. I was building comprehension. I learned more about regulatory language than I ever wanted to know, about reporting obligations, about how incidents are categorized depending on who files first, and how wording can shift responsibility without technically lying. I read guidelines written in language so dry, it almost lulled you into trusting it. Almost. What stood out wasn't a single explosive detail. It was an accumulation. A form was submitted later than it should have been. A witness statement is summarized rather than quoted. A procedural shortcut that, on its own, could be defended, but when combined with others, suggested intent to control the narrative. And still I said nothing. Not because I was unsure, but because I was learning something crucial. People reveal more when they believe the story is settled. My father spoke freely about ethics in abstract terms, about accountability in other people. He criticized public figures who hid behind technicalities. Each time, I listened. Not with judgment, but with attention. I wanted to understand how he saw himself. What I realized was unsettling in its subtlety. He didn't think of himself as someone who'd done something wrong. He thought of himself as someone who had managed a situation, who had prevented greater harm, who had made a difficult but necessary choice. In his mind, responsibility wasn't about truth. It was about the outcome. That distinction clarified everything. It explained why he'd never admitted fault, not even privately. Why was the accident always framed as inevitable? Why questions felt threatening to him? They didn't just risk exposure. They risked dismantling the identity he'd built around being a protector. I began to understand that confrontation would never produce honesty. Not because he was incapable of it, but because it would require him to reframe himself in a way he wasn't prepared to do. So I kept preparing. I located public records that had never been discussed. Old permits, archived reports, items anyone could access but no one had bothered to. I noticed how often families confuse privacy with invisibility, assuming that if something isn't talked about, it isn't findable. They're wrong. The deeper I went, the calmer I became. The emotional charge drained away, replaced by something steadier. I wasn't chasing a revelation anymore. I was assembling a timeline that could stand on its own without my voice attached to it. That was important, because I didn't want this to be dismissed as a daughter's grievance, or reframed as emotional confusion. I wanted the facts to speak in a language no one could interrupt. No one noticed how my questions changed either. I stopped asking why and started asking when. Who processed that? Which department handled it? Neutral questions, logistical ones, the kind that sounds boring enough to escape suspicion. People answered them easily. That was the most revealing part. How little resistance there was when emotion was removed from the equation. How freely information flowed when it didn't feel accusatory. When curiosity was framed as an organization rather than a challenge. I realized then how deeply people rely on tone to assess threat. How rarely they question motive when the delivery feels familiar. And I was very familiar. There were nights when I sat with everything laid out in front of me, documents, notes, timelines, and felt the full weight of it. Not grief, not rage, responsibility. Because by then, it was no longer about what my father had done. It was about what I was now in possession of. About what silence would mean going forward. They never noticed the shift because they didn't know what to look for. They thought preparation would look like anger, like withdrawal, like distance. Instead, it looked like me doing exactly what I'd always done, being quiet, being thorough, and becoming someone they could no longer afford to underestimate. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It settled, piece by piece, document by document, until there was no longer any ambiguity left to negotiate with myself. No room to reinterpret, no comfort in uncertainty. The private reveal wasn't a moment of shock, it was a moment of confirmation. The final element came from a source I hadn't expected to hear from at all. A name I'd seen before, but only in passing. Buried in a report, referenced indirectly. Someone was listed as present, then quickly removed from relevance by phrasing that suggested unreliability. Uncooperative. Unclear recollection. Words that quietly discredit without explaining why. I found her through public records. It took time, careful verification. I didn't reach out immediately. I sat with the possibility first, weighing the ethical line I was about to cross. Then I sent a message that contained no accusations, no demands. Just context. She responded days later. Not defensively, not eagerly. Relieved. She told me she'd waited years for someone to ask the right question. That she'd spoken once, early on, and learned very quickly that her version of events was inconvenient. That after being told, politely, that she must be mistaken, she'd stopped trying. What she shared didn't contradict the documents. It completed them. She described a sequence of events my father had never acknowledged. A decision point. A moment where intervention was possible, but inconvenient. Where reporting accurately would have triggered consequences he wasn't willing to face. She didn't embellish. She didn't speculate about motive. She stuck to what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she'd reported, and how it had been reframed after the fact. When I finished reading her words, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt quiet, because now, there was no version of the story left that allowed innocence to coexist with evidence. No interpretation where this was simply bad luck or a misunderstanding. The truth had shape now. Weight. And it belonged to me. I didn't tell her what I planned to do. I didn't promise anything. I thanked her for trusting me with something she'd carried alone for a long time. That felt important, to acknowledge the cost of speaking without making her responsible for what came next. After that, I sat with everything. The records, the timeline, the witness account, the years of dismissal that suddenly made sense in retrospect. I let the emotional response arrive if it wanted to. It didn't. What arrived instead was clarity. I understood then why this had taken so long to surface. Not because the truth was hidden particularly well, but because everyone involved had relied on the same assumption, that no one close enough would ever look closely. Families are powerful that way. They protect narratives through silence, not force, through expectation, through roles. And I had been perfectly cast. This was the private reveal. Not a discovery that changed my feelings, but one that changed my obligations. Because knowing something this complete carries responsibility, whether you want it or not. I could no longer tell myself I was staying out of it. I was in it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from distress, but from mental activity. Evaluating options, consequences. What justice would mean in this context, Not abstractly, but practically. One thing was already clear. Whatever I chose to do next, I would do it without spectacle, without asking permission, and without pretending that blood alone could outweigh accountability. People talk about decisions as if they arrive fully formed, like a door you either walk through or don't. That wasn't how it happened for me. What I faced wasn't a single choice, it was a narrowing. Once the truth was complete, my options didn't disappear, but they lost their neutrality. Each one began to carry a moral weight I could feel distinctly. I laid them out carefully, the way I'd laid out documents before, clearly, without emotion, without trying to soften their edges. Option 1, do nothing. I could close my files, lock the information away, live with the knowledge privately, and protect what remains of my family structure. No public rupture, no legal consequences, just silence, this time informed. This option promised peace on the surface. It also required me to accept that the version of myself who knew the truth would never be allowed to speak. That I would become complicit not through action, but through restraint. Option 2, confront my father privately. I imagined it in every possible variation. Calm conversation, evidence presented gently, an invitation for him to explain, to acknowledge, to take responsibility on his own terms. But every scenario ended the same way, not in accountability, but in reframing, minimization, moral bargaining. I knew him too well by then to believe he would suddenly choose transparency over self-preservation. And even if he did, privately, it would change nothing beyond us. Option 3, report what I had found. Not emotionally, not publicly, but formally, through the proper channels, with documentation, with corroboration, with a record that could not be edited by tone or authority. This option was irreversible. Once chosen, it would no longer belong to me. It would move through systems designed to evaluate facts without regard for family ties. It would expose my father not as a parent, but as a subject. This option carried consequences I could not control. For him, for my family, for me, I took time with that reality. I didn't rush it. I considered the practical fallout, legal, social, and emotional. I imagined holidays that would never feel the same, phone calls that would stop coming, a version of myself that would be labeled disloyal, cold, unforgiving. And I asked myself a harder question than, what do I want? I asked, what does doing nothing cost? Because by then, the truth had shifted the frame. Silence was no longer neutral. It actively protected a false narrative, one that had already caused harm. I thought about the witness who had been dismissed, about the record altered just enough to deflect responsibility, about the accident being described as inevitable when it wasn't. And I thought about myself, about the years I'd spent being edited out of my own understanding, trusting explanations that had been carefully shaped to end the conversation. I realized then that this wasn't a choice between family and justice. It was a choice between loyalty to a person and loyalty to reality. I didn't feel righteous when I understood that. I felt tired, clear, grounded in a way that left no room for dramatics. I didn't want my father punished out of anger. I wanted the truth to exist independently of him. So I made the decision quietly. I prepared the complaint the same way I'd prepared everything else, thoroughly, precisely, without commentary. I included only what could be verified. I removed my own language wherever possible. I let the evidence speak. The day I submitted it, I didn't feel like I was betraying anyone. I felt like I was stepping out of a role that had required me to absorb contradictions for too long. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell my family. I didn't announce anything. I let the process begin without spectacle. Because the moment I chose truth over silence, the story no longer needed my voice to move forward. After the complaint was filed, nothing happened. At least nothing visible. That's the part people don't talk about. The long stretch where you've done something irreversible, but the world hasn't reacted yet. No phone calls, no letters, no dramatic shifts in behavior. Just the same routines continuing, unaware that something foundational has already changed. I kept living my life exactly as before. I went to work. I answered messages. I showed up to family dinners when invited. I listened to my father talk about mundane things, home repairs, errands, other people's mistakes, with the same calm attentiveness I always had. And he had no idea. That wasn't cruelty. It was containment. I understood now that once a process like this begins, interference, even emotional interference, can distort it. I didn't want my feelings to contaminate the facts. I didn't want my father's reactions to influence my resolve. so I let the machinery work in its own time. Behind the scenes, I took additional steps. I organized my personal affairs carefully, updated emergency contacts, ensured my finances were independent. Not because I expected retaliation, but because clarity demands preparedness. I wasn't bracing for chaos. I was removing vulnerabilities. I also prepared emotionally, though not in the way people imagine. I didn't rehearse confrontations. I didn't write letters I'd never send. Instead, I practiced restraint. I observed my own impulses to explain, to justify, to soften what I'd done, and let them pass. This wasn't about being understood. It was about being aligned. I noticed how easily people continued to underestimate me. How my silence was read as compliance. How my father still spoke to me as if nothing could ever shift our dynamic. That familiarity, once comforting, now felt oddly instructive. It confirmed I had made the right choice not to warn anyone, because a warning would have triggered defense. Defense would have triggered narrative control, and narrative control was the very thing I was stepping away from. Weeks passed, then months. At some point, the quiet became heavier. Not because of fear, but because of anticipation. I knew that systems move slowly, but they do move. I trusted that the documentation I'd submitted would reach people whose job it was to notice what families ignore. During that time, I learned something important about power. It isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's the ability to wait without flinching, to let consequences arrive on their own timeline. I didn't feel dominant. I felt resolved. And that resolution gave me a strange freedom. I no longer felt responsible for managing my father's comfort or my family's peace. I had already chosen a different responsibility, one that didn't require approval. When the first subtle signs appeared, they didn't come as accusations or alarms. They came as questions. Questions my father couldn't answer easily. And that's when I knew the silence was ending. Not because I broke it, but because the truth was beginning to surface on its own. The first ripple reached my father before it reached me. I noticed it in his tone before I heard any facts. A new sharpness when he spoke about bureaucracy. A sudden irritation with processes he'd once defended. He mentioned being asked for clarification on old matters, brushing it off as administrative nonsense. I listened. The questions were coming from outside the family now, from places where certainty requires documentation, not confidence. And that shift unsettled him. At first, he treated it like an inconvenience. He joked about it, rolled his eyes, assured everyone it would amount to nothing. His posture was still relaxed, but something had changed. His stories grew shorter, less polished. People began to feel it too, even if they didn't understand why. Family conversations tightened. Topics were avoided without being named. There was a collective sense of waiting for something, though no one could articulate what. When my father spoke, people listened more carefully, not because they doubted him, because they sensed something fragile beneath the certainty. I stayed exactly where I'd always been. That was the part that confused them most. I wasn't agitated. I wasn't withdrawn. I didn't ask questions or offer theories. I showed up with the same steady presence, the same unremarkable demeanor. If anything, I seemed calmer. And that calm had an effect. It created contrast. As my father grew more defensive, my quietness stood out, not as passivity, but as composure. People didn't consciously connect the two, but they felt the imbalance. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as pressure, requests for documentation, follow-ups on timelines, inconsistencies noted without accusation. The kind of scrutiny that doesn't raise its voice, but refuses to be dismissed. My father tried to manage it the way he always had, through confidence, through explanation, through the expectation that authority, once asserted, would be accepted. It wasn't. That's when frustration entered the room. I saw it in his shoulders, in how he paced while on the phone, in the way he began revisiting the accident aloud, unprompted, reframing it again and again, as if repetition could restore stability. Each retelling felt slightly different. That was new. People noticed. Not consciously, not immediately, but repetition draws attention to what's unresolved. And suddenly, the accident was no longer settled. It was circulating again, awkwardly, without the careful containment it once had. I watched my family struggle with that shift. They didn't blame my father yet. They blamed uncertainty. The inconvenience of reopening something painful, the discomfort of ambiguity. And quietly, they began to look for someone to anchor them. They didn't look at me. Not at first. But they noticed I wasn't asking for reassurance, that I wasn't distressed, that I wasn't confused. Loss doesn't always announce itself as loss. Sometimes it shows up as the absence of control, as the inability to end a conversation cleanly, as questions that don't accept tone as an answer. My father was losing his ability to direct the narrative, and everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't yet name it. The process moved forward without me appearing anywhere in it. That was intentional. I wasn't interested in being seen as the cause. I was interested in letting cause and effect align on their own terms. Because once consequences begin, they don't require your participation. They only require time. By the time my father realized something was truly wrong, the window for controlling it had already closed. You can feel that moment in people, not when they're confronted, but when they stop improvising, when the usual tools no longer work. His confidence didn't vanish overnight. It fractured in stages, each one quieter than the last. First came reassurance. He told the family everything was fine, that it was just procedural, that these things happen when records get old. Then came irritation. He complained about incompetence, about people digging where there's nothing to find. His tone sharpened, his patience thinned. He began repeating himself more often, as if volume and insistence could substitute for clarity. Finally, there was hesitation. He started asking questions instead of answering them. Not directly, never directly, but in the way he probed conversations, searching for confirmation, watching reactions, measuring silence. That's when panic appeared. Not loud panic, not visible collapse. Strategic panic. He revisited old contacts, tried to reconstruct what had been filed, when, and by whom. He spoke vaguely about setting the record straight, as though the record were a living thing that could be persuaded to cooperate. But records don't respond to tone, and systems don't forget what's been submitted. The mistake he made, without knowing it, was assuming there was still someone to negotiate with. Someone whose emotions could be appealed to. Someone invested in preserving the story as it stood. There wasn't. Whatever he might have done earlier, acknowledged responsibility, corrected inaccuracies, accepted consequences, those paths required timing. That time had passed. I watched all of this from a distance that felt both strange and inevitable. He never asked me directly if I knew anything, never suspected my involvement. The role I'd played for decades protected me completely. To him, I was still the safe one, the reasonable one, the daughter who wouldn't disrupt things unnecessarily. That assumption was the final miscalculation. As the scrutiny intensified, the family dynamic shifted again. People stopped seeking reassurance from my father and started seeking it from each other. The certainty they'd relied on was no longer available, and no one wanted to be the first to question it out loud. So they circled, and in that circling denial became impossible to maintain. When the formal notice arrived, quiet, procedural, unmistakable, the illusion collapsed. There was no dramatic scene, no confrontation at the table, just a piece of paper that reframed the accident not as a closed chapter, but as an active inquiry. My father didn't rage. He went very still. That stillness wasn't acceptance. It was a calculation without options, the realization that no amount of explanation could restore what had been lost, control over the narrative. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold. What I felt was distance, not emotional distance, ethical distance. A clear separation between my identity and his choices. For the first time, I wasn't carrying his version of events inside me, adjusting myself around it. The family didn't turn on him immediately. That came later, in quieter ways. Trust erodes slowly, through unanswered questions, through inconsistencies that can't be smoothed over. By then, fixing it was no longer possible. Not because no one wanted to, but because accountability had moved beyond intention. And once that happens, regret becomes irrelevant. The conversation happened on an ordinary morning. No build-up, no announcement, just a quiet request from my father to talk, delivered with a careful neutrality that told me he already knew something had shifted, even if he didn't yet know how. We sat at the same kitchen table where so many conversations had ended before they began. He didn't accuse me. He didn't raise his voice. He looked tired in a way I'd never seen before, not physically, but structurally, as if the framework he'd relied on for decades had finally given out. "I don't understand how this is happening," he said. I let the silence sit. That was new for him. He waited, then added, "Someone must have misunderstood something." I met his eyes, not challengingly, not defensively, just steadily. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. That was all. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when they realize the conversation they're in isn't going to follow the path they'd prepared for. He asked me how much I knew. I answered honestly, "Enough!" There was no point in listing documents, no need to reference witnesses. The systems were already doing that work. This conversation wasn't about evidence, it was about recognition. For the first time, he didn't correct me, didn't reframe, didn't assert certainty. He looked at me as if recalibrating, seeing not the role I'd played, but the person sitting across from him. "You could have come to me," he said quietly. "I did," I replied, "years ago in small ways." He didn't deny that. That mattered more than any apology. The rest of the conversation stayed restrained, minimal. He spoke about pressure, about fear of consequences, about believing he was protecting people. I listened without interrupting, without validating or rejecting his explanations. When he finished, I said one thing. "I didn't do this to punish you. I did it because the truth couldn't stay managed anymore." He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. There was no closure in that moment, no forgiveness exchanged, no absolution sought or granted, just an understanding that the dynamic we'd lived inside was over. When we stood up, he looked smaller, not diminished, but human in a way he'd never allowed himself to be before. I felt no triumph, only finality. The confrontation didn't heal anything, it clarified it. And that was enough. After everything surfaced, people expected me to change. They watched for signs: anger, relief, collapse, bitterness. They looked for a visible transformation that would help them make sense of what had happened. Something dramatic enough to justify the rupture. That didn't come. What changed wasn't my personality, it was my alignment. For the first time in my life, there was no gap between what I knew and how I lived. No internal editing, no careful softening of truth to preserve comfort. That absence of friction brought a kind of calm I hadn't known was possible. I didn't feel lighter because something heavy had been removed. I felt steadier because I was no longer carrying something that wasn't mine. My relationship with my father didn't end. It redefined itself. Boundaries replaced assumptions. Honesty replaced roles. We spoke less, but when we did, the conversation didn't require performance. Some family members pulled away, others grew closer. A few tried to reassign the old dynamics, hinting that things could go back to normal if everyone just stopped talking about it. I didn't argue. I simply didn't participate. That, I learned, is its own form of clarity. In my work, I became more visible, not louder, but firmer. I trusted my instincts without waiting for consensus. I stopped minimizing my observations. People responded to that shift almost immediately, even if they couldn't articulate why. Quiet doesn't have to mean small. It can mean precise. I no longer confuse peace with avoidance or loyalty with silence. I understand now that emotional maturity isn't about absorbing discomfort for the sake of others. It's about refusing to distort reality to maintain an illusion. What surprised me most was the absence of bitterness. I don't wake up angry. I don't rehearse the past. I don't need vindication. Justice, in this case, wasn't about punishment. It was about restoring proportion, about letting actions be met with their natural consequences. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped protecting a false version of it. And in doing so, I gave myself something I'd never had before. The freedom to be exact. To be honest, without being cruel. To stand still when others need reassurance I can't offer. This is who I am now. Not hardened, not heroic. Just aligned. For a long time, I thought stories like this were supposed to end with a clear emotion. Relief, vindication, forgiveness, something definitive that signals the work is done. This one didn't. What it gave me instead was something quieter and more durable. Perspective. I understand now why so many truths stay buried inside families. Not because people are cruel, but because they are afraid of what clarity will cost them. Narratives become shelter, roles become protection, and silence starts to feel like love, even when it isn't. What I learned the hard way is that silence isn't neutral once it begins to cause harm. It becomes participation. Filing that complaint didn't make me brave. It made me honest. And honesty, when it's stripped of drama and resentment, doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It feels lonely, procedural, unremarkable. But over time, it restores something essential. Integrity. Not the kind you perform for others, but the kind that allows you to sleep without rearranging your memories to make them easier to live with. I didn't win anything. I lost illusions. I lost a version of my father I wanted to believe in. I lost the comfort of being seen as easy and understanding at all costs. What I gained was proportion, the ability to say, this happened and it mattered, without exaggeration, without minimization, without needing anyone else to agree in order for it to be real. Justice, I've learned, isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself as righteousness. Sometimes it looks like a record corrected, a truth acknowledged, a cycle quietly broken. And sometimes it looks like a person stepping out of a role that required them to disappear. If you're listening to this and carrying a truth you've been taught to manage instead of acknowledge, I won't tell you what to do. Every situation is different. Every cost is personal. But I will ask you this. At what point does protecting the story start costing you yourself? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.